right, thanks. And hello, everybody. I'm an ecologist, and I study animal populations, and the work that I do is applied in nature, and it has implications for conservation and management of species. And doing this, I have a lot of problems that really lend themselves well to computational solutions, and that's how I got involved with the network here today. The talk I'm going to be talking about is on landscape design for conservation and management of animal populations using computational sustainability solutions. And the work is motivated by some research that I'm doing with, both myself and with my collaborators on Andean bears in Ecuador. But the work that I'm talking about really has applications to a host of other species that are threatened, endangered, and/or rare. And when we think about conservation of spatially structured populations, we think about primarily two different objectives. The first being that we need to preserve populations that have enough individuals so that the populations are robust to demographic stochasticity. And then we need to maintain connectivity. And connectivity allows for dispersal and gene flow of these populations so that the populations are robust to genetic stochasticity. And when we think about connectivity, I should first define it, and then people use connectivity then to define or establish corridors. And a connectivity is the degree to which the landscape is either facilitating or impeding the movement of organisms. And the important point that I'm going to make here is that I'm particularly interested in functional connectivity. And functional connectivity is the product of both the structure of the landscape and how the individual organisms are responding to that landscape structure. And this is in contrast to structural connectivity, which is just the basic feature of the landscape, so habitat amount, for example. And that doesn't include the response of the individual organisms to the landscape structure. And then people often use connectivity to then develop corridors. And a corridor is a region of the landscape that helps to facilitate the movement of individuals through that landscape, with the ultimate goal of increasing gene flow and reducing rates of inbreeding, and then down the line, hopefully increasing the fitness and survival of that species. And there's a lot of different corridor design applications that are out there, but the big question is, are corridors actually providing connectivity for species? And I think that's pretty hotly debated in the literature right now. The work that I mentioned, that this work is motivated by some research in Ecuador that I'm working on with my collaborators, and the overarching goal of this research is to aid in the design of sustainable landscapes that support both human quality of life and conservation. And by conservation, what I'm talking about is biodiversity conservation. But in this application, we're using Andean bears as an umbrella species. Andean bears in Ecuador are an endangered species, and they represent a good species to use for biodiversity because they have very large home range requirements and a diversity of habitat needs that helps to meet the requirements of a host of other species. The area that we're working on in Ecuador is centered around the metropolitan district of Quito. That's that red dot you'll see in the Ecuador map in yellow. And the goal is to protect two large connected areas, to connect those between the metropolitan district of Quito. And since we're working with both issues related to the ecology of the species and the environment, we're talking about society and we're talking about economics, this really lends itself well to these computational sustainability solutions. So it is a challenge to try to integrate all of these objectives into the design of a sustainable landscape. So when we think about corridors, most of the previous work on corridors has really focused on the pattern of landscape structure. That is the structural connectivity. So the total amount of suitable habitat, for example, or the distance between patches of suitable habitat. But really the impetus for corridor design is the process of animal movement. That is functional connectivity, or how individual organisms are responding to landscape structure. And it's important in the past research, largely the estimation, or not estimation, but the calculation of a resistance of the movement of individuals through a landscape is based on expert opinion quite typically. We're trying to move away from this expert opinion driven approach to actually estimating landscape connectivity and how resistant landscapes are to individual animal movement. And two technological developments allow us to do this. One is non-invasive sampling. And so this is sampling animals that doesn't require us to actually handle them or capture animals or put radio collars or radio tags on them. These are methods that allow us to passively sample animals. So for example, remotely triggered trail cameras, we can take pictures of individuals, and if they have distinctive markings, we can identify those individuals. Or we can use highly trained dogs that detect the scat of species, and then we can use genetic methods to extract the DNA and then identify the individuals that way. So with using these non-invasive sampling methods, we can then use a new class of statistical models called spatial capture-recapture models. And these models allow us to estimate both abundance of species and the density of species, but more importantly, they really allow us to address questions of spatial population ecology. And we can do so from the data that we're deriving from these non-invasive sampling methods. And importantly, it's the spatial location of where we're detecting these individuals that is useful for us in addressing these spatial ecology questions. And so using spatial capture-recapture models, we can estimate two of the most important processes for conserving these spatially structured populations. That is abundance and connectivity, and we can do this simultaneously in these models. You'll hear about two talks at the conference this week about spatial capture-recapture models. One is by Andy Royal, and he'll be giving an overview of spatial capture-recapture models. And the second is by Dan Linden, and he's talking about incorporating uncertain identity in these models. So if we can identify the species, for example, but we're unsure which individual that species belongs to, we can incorporate that information by using the spatial location of those captures. So Dan will be talking about that. So a brief overview of spatial capture-recapture models. Spatial capture-recapture models are hierarchical or state space models that have two different model components. One is an observation process model, and one is an ecological state process model. And if you look at the bottom left, this is the observation process model, which shows encounter probability of an individual, and it shows that the probability of encountering or detecting that individual declines as the distance between an individual home range center and a trap increases. So you're less likely to detect that individual if a trap is far away from the home range center than if the trap is exactly at the center of the home range. The other part of the spatial capture-recapture model is this ecological state process model, and this is a point process model that describes the distribution of individuals in space. So in figure 2, these are traps in the pluses, and the red dots are home range centers of these individuals. The encounter model is typically this bivariate normal encounter model, and the distance model is based on Euclidean distance. But this Euclidean distance part of this encounter probability might not be biologically reasonable when the structure of the landscape is actually influencing animal movement. And we might expect movement to deviate from this Euclidean distance model as the cost or the resistance of the landscape is actually increasing. And so in this encounter probability model, we can replace the Euclidean distance with an ecological distance using least cost path. And then we can add another parameter to this model, and we can this called alpha 2, you'll see that highlighted in green there, and we can estimate a resistance parameter. So that's measuring the strength of landscape association. And so now we have an explicit measurement that we can use about animal movement around home ranges to estimate landscape connectivity. And we can use this estimator and derive two different estimators of landscape connectivity. One is potential connectivity, and the second is density-weighted connectivity. So if we look at the top slide here, this is a resistance surface. It could be anything, but here I've just described areas that have high development. So areas that have high development are darker shades of gray. And then we can estimate potential connectivity by assuming there's an individual in every pixel on the landscape, and we can calculate the least cost path between that pixel and every other pixel in the landscape and sum those up across all of the individuals in the population to get this population level potential connectivity. So in this map here, you'll see that the area in the darkest orange has areas of highest potential connectivity. We can also calculate realized density, which is the estimated density of individual animal activity centers within every pixel. And so if you look at the realized density surface, the area highlighted in the blue circle are the areas that have the highest density. So we can combine potential connectivity with realized density to come up with this model-based estimator of connectivity that we're calling density-weighted connectivity. So these are areas that have both high densities of the species, but also have high landscape connectivity and allow movement of individuals across the landscape. So the area that I've highlighted in blue on the slide to the, or on the figure to the right are the areas that have the highest density-weighted connectivity. And you'll note that if we're making landscape scale management decisions, if we were just talking about potential connectivity in isolation without thinking about density, we would have selected very different areas if we were just looking at the areas that have the highest values for those metrics. So this density-weighted connectivity is going to be useful for us in landscape design applications and optimizations. And that's exactly what we're doing. For the corridor design problem, basically it's a large conservation reserve design problem that we have to select a series of parcels across this landscape that are maximizing a conservation value. And we're suggesting using density-weighted connectivity as this metric that we're trying to maximize, of course subject to a budget constraint. So there's additional complexities that we have here as well, such that when we're calculating these connectivity values, they will actually change depending on a change in the conservation state, if we're protecting a particular node or not. We might have alternative models of land conservation, for example, purchase or easement of different parcels that can induce different conservation outcomes and hence different utilities to the species in question. We can also add multiple species in terms of the reserve design optimization. And then there's also a large source of uncertainty that's inherent here, in that we may have failure to acquire a particular parcel. So there's some sort of partial controllability issue here at play as well. So these are all issues that we hope to address using computational solutions in the future. And there are 2 talks at the conference this week that you can hear that are talking about different issues related to this conservation reserve design problem. One is by Amrita Gupta, and she's talking about using these model-based estimators of landscape connectivity in this corridor design application. And the other one is by Dana Moran, and she's going to be talking about modeling animal home range and landscape connectivity from these spatial capture-recapture models. So instead of using least cost path, she's going to be talking about using circuit distance or resistance distance. And finally, as I mentioned in the beginning, this is a work by myself, but a large host of collaborators who I'd like to acknowledge here, as well as funding from the Atkinson Center for a Sustainable Future and the NSF Expeditions in Computing Award. Thanks.
Thank you very much.